Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. This is the IAP2 Canada and the United States webinar on Focus on Diversity. My name is Amelia Shaw, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. On behalf of IAP2 Canada and IAP2 United States, we are absolutely thrilled to have all of you joining us for today's webinar. We have been overwhelmed by the interest in today's webinar. We have approximately 80 people, both in the United States and Canada, that have expressed an interest in today's topic. So we're really pretty excited about it. So you're going to be seeing many more people joining us as the webinar continues today. So just a few house rules first. You will notice that all of you have been muted. There is a reason for this. The one thing that we know is that if we have more than two people unmuted at any one time, we get a tremendous amount of static. So we do have control here, and I'm joined by Drew Snyder, who's also helping me out with this. So we will mute you if you're not muted yourself. So that's just to let you know. It's not to not encourage or engage or involve all of you in this process. It's just to make sure that everyone can hear. So we will make sure that you're muted for it. There are a couple of ways for you to contact us. One of them is by raising your hand, and if we see your hand raised, we'll try and get to you and find out if there's something that you would like to ask us. And then there are two other ways. You'll see a chat forum, and you have the ability on the chat forum to send a question or a comment or a suggestion or a recommendation to the entire audience. So please don't hesitate to do that. You can just pop it in there. And you also have the ability to ask questions. So don't hesitate to put a question in. If I see it, I will do my best to respond to you or to include everyone in that discussion. So I'm hoping that everyone's good with the process. The one thing we know about technology is it's wonderful. It's also a little frightening, so please hang in there with us as we move through today's session. So just to let everybody know, we do have 4 speakers today: Carol Newman, Francesca Patricolo, Stephani McCallum, and Maren Sanchez. Now we are actually going to be starting with Francesca. We have asked each of our speakers to speak for 10 minutes. If there is a burning question, please go ahead and ask me, and I will then let Francesca know, and we'll respond to that question immediately. Otherwise, we'd actually like to hold off questions until after all 4 of our presenters have spoken. We only have an hour for this session, and we really do want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to present. As well, I do want to let you know that all our presenters will be using PowerPoint as well, so you should be able to see their presentation on your screen. Just a quick reminder, we will be taping today's session, so for those of you that want to see it afterwards, we will be archiving it on both the IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA sites, normally about 48 hours after the session's completed. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Francesca. And Francesca Patricolo is Principal of Voice Public Involvement, an Oregon-based consulting firm specializing in community engagement processes for planning and public policy decisions making. VPI's approach puts social equity in the forefront and applies the platinum rule to cross-cultural dynamics. How would your community like to be treated, and what does success look like to your community? Her academic achievements include a master's degree in conflict and dispute resolution and community and regional planning from the University of Oregon. Francesca, it's a real pleasure to invite you to today's webinar. So now I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Amelia. Thanks for having me. Since I only have 10 minutes and a lot to say, I'll be talking a little faster than I normally would. And I've written out comments, and I'll be reading, but I'll be trying to sound like I'm not reading, so I hope you'll bear with me. The framework I'll speak from today will be a little bit different than my colleagues, because I'll be talking about getting young people and people from diverse backgrounds and communities involved with public participation as practitioners themselves. At the IAP2 North American Conference just a few weeks ago in Salt Lake City, my colleague Joe Niehaus and I presented a session called The SP2 Model, How to Support Diverse and Emerging Practitioners in P2 Fields. And so this is almost the real quick version of that. I'll tell you about the SP2 model and then leave you with some thoughts for getting started supporting emerging and diverse practitioners. So first, I have a little bit of dogma here. Our communities are diverse. They're also made up of, and therefore should be made for, young and old alike, and everyone in between. Our communities are also going to become more diverse, and we need to be able to include. If we agree that we should engage the ideas, beliefs, concerns, and participation from people of all backgrounds and of different ages, we inherently need to create opportunity for diversity in practitioners themselves. If there are any students out there listening, here's a thesis idea for you. If you could compare demographic data for a given area and compare it with demographic data of public participation practitioners in that area, and you'd first need to define what it means to be a P2 practitioner or who falls into that category. And that might be a whole thesis in itself, but I think it would be really incredibly useful information for us to help see how well we're actually doing in terms of attracting diverse practitioners into the field. It's my hunch that we could be doing a better job, and so I've acted on this hunch. When I was a graduate student, I started SP2, and SP2 stands for Students for Public Participation, and it's both a student group at the University of Oregon as UOSP2 and what we're calling a global movement to get practitioner-supported public participation student groups to sprout up everywhere else. Now, the IAP2 Code of Ethics includes what's called support of the practice. It says we will mentor new practitioners in the field and educate decision makers and the public about the value and use of public participation. So with SP2, we're spreading the IAP2 core values and ethics and supporting the practice. We want practitioners to support students in forming and running SP2s of their own, and students can borrow our mission and credos and bylaws, and then they can keep what they like, change what they see could be improved, and develop their own ways of doing things for their unique communities and cultures. So in telling you about the SP2 at the University of Oregon and our SP2 Global Front, we hope to offer you a case study for creating these communities. So what you see on your screen is our mission statement. We're a diverse group of emerging practitioners dedicated to learning and expanding public engagement in ways that are collaborative and inclusive. So this is who we are and what we do. The other way that we show who we are and what we do is through what we call seven credos. And those are statements that I'll just kind of quickly go through. So we created one for professional development, one for collaborative learning, one for best practices, one for networking, and these will be in the show notes and also available online. I'll show you how you can reach these. We have one for effective and sustainable decision making. And then here's what I wanted to show you. Our last two are about diversity within Students for Public Participation and outside of Students for Public Participation. So we say, we will cultivate a cross-disciplinary and diverse group of students dedicated to practicing high-quality public engagement, and we will actively strive to engage the ideas, beliefs, concerns, and participation from people of all backgrounds. So that's who we are and what we do. And with the structure, there are several leadership roles in the student group, and they're outlined in our bylaws. And the SP2 president sits on our IAP2 Cascade Chapter Executive Board. A main point here, students come to our SP2 meetings and such because they like it, and that's the only reason they come back. I want to take you to our last slide there. So far, students have been able to volunteer facilitate for large local public involvement events, win an IAP2 Cascade chapter scholarship, and get jobs because of their activity in SP2. My colleague, Jo Niehaus, says SP2 is what made her discover she wanted to be a P2 professional. So here's a little tangent, and then I'll explain how it relates to providing a good experience for potential emerging and diverse practitioners. When you're talking about including younger folks in public participation and in their communities, whether they're children or college students, or if you're talking about including diverse populations from traditionally underrepresented communities, it's important to recognize that for many of them, this experience you're providing in public participation as a practitioner may be of this participant's first forays into getting involved at all. Consider that you may be setting the tone for what they think of community involvement in general, how meaningful it is, how much they can or can't impact decision making. Ultimately, this can lead to their first forming opinions about trusting government, beliefs about agencies having their best interests at heart or not, and whether or not they might like to ever be involved in any kind of public engagement ever again. Now apply those considerations to a student's first foray into learning about public participation professions, and I hope you'll see how important it is that practitioners reach out to students and help them understand the field in general and have a positive experience with it as they learn core values and ethics and best practices. And the SP2 is a way to do that, and the idea is really to strive for having fun. There are a lot of things competing for anyone's time and attention, and for younger folks, creativity and play and fun things will trump boring old stuffy meetings any day. This is the same for our student group meetings. My thought is that if you want to involve younger folks, and indeed a whole range of folks who would rather have fun than go to a public meeting, you can get creative. So here's some examples. At the beginning of every UO SP2 meeting, for example, a different student facilitates their own icebreaker, and they really have fun. Sometimes I think students showed up just for the icebreaker, and that's great. They left happy. They were not disappointed. Another example of fun is to write the bylaws. The UO SP2 threw a bylaw bash at the local bar. So they got together and they did what they needed to do, but they had fun doing it. My thought is that successful SP2s will find their own ways to incorporate fun into everything they do. So if you're working with young people and students, here are my final thoughts. If you care for reaching a diverse population, then you should concern yourself also with making practitioners representative of the diverse population pool at large as well. And ask students themselves how they want to participate, and I guarantee they'll give you creative ideas. By the way, asking will help you fulfill the platinum rule, which is to treat others as they would like to be treated, as opposed to the golden rule, which is to treat others as you would like them to treat you. So on my soapbox for a moment, we treat others as they would like to be treated because, of course, it's about them. And maybe they do things differently in their neck of the woods or in their culture, so they would want to be treated the way they would like to be treated. It's a way to be culturally competent, and the very essence of the platinum rule is encapsulated in every one of the IAP2 core values. So that's all I have time for now. Links to this information, including our mission, credos, and bylaws, can be found on our UO SP2 Facebook page, which anyone is welcome to join. It's also on our SP2 LinkedIn page, which houses our global community. So there's students from the USA, Canada, China, South Africa, Australia in there, maybe some other places. Links can be found on my blog at voicepublicinvolvement.com. And students and supportive practitioners are invited to join us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Also, if you're doing something in support of the practice, especially with practitioner-supported public participation student groups of any sort, would you please contact me? I'd love to hear what you're doing, and my contact information can be found on my website or probably attached to the show notes. That's all.
Francesca, you did a fabulous job. Thank you so very much for that. Exactly 10 minutes. And your enthusiasm and passion is just fabulous. Thank you very, very much. Much appreciated. Now, before we head on to the next presenter, which is going to be Stephani, I just want to confirm, was there any burning questions for Francesca, or can we come back to that at the end of the session? If you've got a burning question, either put it on the chat or put it on the questions. I'm not seeing any, so it's going to be my great pleasure now to introduce Stephani. Stephani Roy McCallum of Dialogue Partners will explore the importance of using a cultural lens in engagement, with emphasis on the influences of beliefs, values, worldviews, attitudes, and perceptions, and the impact that these have on group processes. Dialogue Partners has designed and delivered workshops that focus on the importance of culture and diversity in public engagement. It's my very good pleasure to introduce Stephani. Stephani, over to you.
Thanks so much, Amelia, and thanks, Francesca, for your presentation too. So I'm going to go off on a bit of a different tangent than Francesca did. I think it'll be interesting to see how the four of us probably come together in a full circle. I want to talk a little bit about the key, I think, to diversity and inclusion and cultural competence in any public engagement process is actually you. And I believe it's in your self-awareness of your own assumptions, your judgments, and your attitudes. I think as a global community or a local community, it is our differences that make us rich rather than our similarities. And engaging in really inclusive ways allows us to be true to IP2's core value number 3, which is about the needs and interests of all being included in a process. So not about representation of those groups or organizations from those groups or a few people who might have similar views, but actually the needs and interests of all. I thought I might walk through just a couple of stories, actually, that have some lessons buried in them for me about engaging in diversity and cultural competence. And these 3 stories, I'll cover one about the fallacy of equality in engaging diverse communities, something I call the ASK principle, and questioning all assumptions. A number of years ago, I was asked to develop a municipal public engagement policy, and one of the goals or evaluation measures we set for ourselves was to ensure that we heard from a wide diversity of residents so that we could build a policy that was really inclusive and really reflected those views. And so for me, this story is very much about whether you consider that there are hard-to-reach participants, and I'm using air quotes when I say hard-to-reach participants, or instead change your mindset and think about whether your process itself is actually a barrier to participation, whether the participants are hard to reach. So in this process, we heard really loudly and clearly from organized, vocal, representative groups. We heard from the educated, the middle class, people already engaged in the system. But when we looked through our data and our evidence of who was participating and who wasn't, it was really clear to us that we were not hearing from those living in poverty, who are marginalized, disenfranchised, who are traditionally without a voice. And so we determined that what we needed to do was to reach out to them. They were not showing up at our processes. Now, we were doing all the things everyone tells you to do when you have a barrier to your process. We were providing childcare and food and bus tickets, but they still weren't coming. So we spent some time at food banks and homeless shelters asking them, first of all, if they knew about the process, and we heard actually that they did, but they didn't think it was for them, which was, I think, just one of the most powerful messages of my career, was that they understood it was a conversation about right to a voice and ways to be involved in decision making, but no one had ever asked them before. And so they didn't think it was a conversation that meant them. I think for me the biggest lesson here is that It doesn't matter if you modify your same or similar process that's targeted at your mainstream participants. That is insufficient to get you those voices and that diversity of views that you really need to ensure you've got a richness of input and perspective for a decision. So tweaking your process to accommodate or to address barriers isn't enough. Actually, your same process with some other modifications doesn't work. You actually need to change your process. Equal isn't always fair. My second story relates to a lot of work I do in Indigenous communities. In Canada, we often call them First Nation or Aboriginal communities. In the US, you'll call them tribal communities. I know that many big consulting firms or many small consulting firms have Aboriginal engagement training or tribal engagement training that will tell you how you should go about engaging or consulting with Indigenous peoples so that you're culturally appropriate and you have a cultural context for the engagement. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't take training. You should take training, but not in how to engage people and understanding community protocols. You probably should have a good understanding of, say, the impact of colonialism or the laws and regulation impacting or requiring you to consult those communities. But I know for certain that every single Indigenous community is different, and it doesn't matter if they're members of the same band or in the same families, that the generic rules do not apply across the board. You can move from one community, 10 miles apart, and the protocols and the requests and requirements of elders or chief and council will be different in every community. A couple of years ago, we worked on a project called the Kikitani Truth Commission, which was a reconciliation and healing commission in Canada's far north with the Inuit people. And I was hired to design, facilitate, and report on healing and reconciliation conversations across the north. And one thing I recognized early on was that I needed to ask rather than assume. And so early in the project, we had a conversation about whether actually I was the right person to facilitate the conversations, because just because you can do it or you're skilled and knowledgeable doesn't necessarily make you the right person to host conversations. And in the end, after lots of discussion on that, we determined that the best role was for me to train co-facilitators who spoke in Inuktitut, and then to co-facilitate and coach them to build that capacity for the conversation. I think you must never assume, and you must always ask what's right for each community. My third story is about a school closure project in a large Canadian municipality in an inner city area with really high immigrant, refugee communities and many people living in poverty. Early on in this project, there were many from these communities who participated, but over time, that participation tapered off. So towards the end of the process, we had many social service organizations and representatives of those organizations actually coming out and accusing us of a process that was systemically discriminatory against these refugee, immigrant, and low-income communities. And we really, really took that accusation to heart and decided that before we rushed to change, we would seek to deeply understand what it was they were saying to us, but to go to the source to understand it. So we knocked on doors, we made phone calls, we talked to people who had participated in the process, and what we heard actually was that they had participated. And they'd said all they had to say, that they trusted the organization to make the right decision, that they were busy doing other things, that they had told the social service organization what they thought, and thanks very much. I think it's really critical that in your engagement process that you have representatives of organizations because they have a story and an experience, but you also go directly to the source. Because if you are certain of a particular viewpoint, I think you cannot assume that that viewpoint is true unless you have actually explicitly been told it from the people who are experiencing it, living it every day. I think in my work, one of my biggest lessons is that the key to inclusion and the key to diversity are in deep listening and in deep understanding. in creating connections between people, to creating a space that's curious and open, and never making assumptions. That the commitment to doing this work, to doing really inclusive work, comes from within. It's about your attitudes, your behaviors, and your assumptions, and always being open to questioning them. Thank you very much.
Stephanie, thank you so very much for that. I am now going to continue on to the next presenter, as I am quite cognizant of time. But again, I am watching both the chat board and the question board, so please don't hesitate to send me a chat or a question, and we'll get back to it in a few minutes. So the next presenter is Maren Sanchez. Marion is currently Community Engagement Consultant for the City of Austin, Texas, where her duties include managing a variety of outreach and engagement projects, developing multicultural strategies and plans, and assisting the city's departments reaching to disenfranchised communities. Marion is a native of Venezuela. She has spent 25 years working to bring Austin's Hispanic community into the public process. And as Community Outreach Coordinator for the Austin Fire Department, she obtained a FEMA grant to provide services to populations at risk and managed to increase applications to the department from Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, and women to over 50%. It's my great pleasure to introduce Maren Sanchez. Marion, over to you.
Hello? Are we on? Hello? Okay. I'm going to assume.
Hi, Marion. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And this is the first time that I do a webinar, so I hope I can perform as well as obviously Amelia, Francesca, and Stephani did. And I have to say that Francesca did a great introduction, and Stephani did a wonderful follow-up, and I guess mine is kind of looking at diversity at even a smaller microscope where you see a little bit more detail about how to engage certain populations. So my conversation for today is going to be related to the Hispanic community, and as you probably all know, I live in Austin, Texas, and so most of this information will apply to the United States, but perhaps it can be applicable in other countries and even in different cultures as well. So there's a lot of statistics and demographics about the Hispanic population in the United States. I'm not really going to go into it, but I welcome all of you to do some research and understand how the numbers of the Hispanic community is growing in tremendous ways. And so I just put one demo here just to show you a little bit of information, but I don't want to spend any time with that because I have other concepts that I like to share with all of you. And the first concept that I want to talk to you about is who are we? And obviously I'm from Venezuela, which somehow I'm Latina, Hispanic. I don't consider myself Chicana or Patricolo, but these are concepts on how the society has been defining in America who we are as Hispanic or Latinos or people coming from a mix. In my particular case, I like to be called Latina, and I'm actually a mix of the people from Africa that came to my country, indigenous population, and people that came from Spain. But it's very important to be very conscious about what's the right terminology of your community. And within your community, there might be subgroups that like to be called themselves in a different way. So be very conscious about it. The census, what they did this time around is they decided to self-identify the groups. So when you look at the census, you could say, I'm Latino, I'm Hispanic, or I'm Anglo with mix and so forth. So you self-identify yourself with the culture that you feel comfortable with. And frankly, I thought that was the best move they did, at least for this time. Here's some other concepts that are important to keep in mind when you talk about outreach into Latinos. And this concept will probably apply to other communities of color, such as Asian communities and so forth. But in the Hispanic community in the United States, you're going to find communities that are isolated. These are communities that typically have just moved to the United States from Mexico or any other country. They establish a home in a place where they're surrounded by people that are similar in their culture, perhaps the same country, and they do business with the same community, the same people with the same language and same belief system. Then we have the acculturated community. And a acculturated community is a more younger, educated, urban Latinos that understand the American culture and that can very easily navigate from one to the other one, and it's creating a whole new culture. And so on the left side, you will see an ad from Target. And Target have been doing a wonderful job this year in trying to bring this acculturated community into the stores. You no longer are seeing just the Spanish and English kind of ads. You're seeing this mix where you have the ad in English, but yet the music is in Spanish and the faces of the community are very clear on the ad. This particular ad, as you can see, is in English, but if you see the faces, you can really tell these are Latino young professionals, young Hispanics that are hip and they're into the culture. The assimilated community is a little bit different, and these are communities that has been many generations in the United States. They have a Hispanic surname. They may not even speak Spanish at all, but they're proud of the heritage. And so these communities are part of the main street. And when you outreach to this community, you have to be conscious that when you do any type of engagement, they're going to be with the people in general. You may not need to do anything different other than understanding their background is Hispanic. And then there's another group that is something that is happening in the United States called Latinization. And what is happening here in America is that our culture is changing. Our American culture is becoming a little bit more Latino per se. You see people that are not really affiliated with the Latino culture, and yet they're celebrating Cinco de Mayo, they're having margaritas, they make enchiladas at home, they enjoy the culture. And so the American culture is also getting some of this Latino culture into the mainstream and becoming a whole different culture per se. And then we have the group of bicultural. These are individuals that can very easily be within the Hispanic community and act as Hispanics, and then move into the American community and act as American or Anglos. And these individuals can very easily move to one place to another one. They're highly educated, and they know how to use the culture in a way that will benefit them. And then, of course, last is the cultural diffusion, which is the new culture that we're creating as we're bringing all these new cultural patterns into a community and creating a whole different culture that is important as we do engagement understand. The language is something that is very critical as you try to outreach to a Latino community. We, for the most part, we speak Spanish, or we speak English, or we're bilingual, or they're dialects. And then there's also local variation that you need to understand from your particular community. There's certain words that mean something completely different, and it's important to study and take time to understand those variations, because you want to make sure that you're not insulting anybody and that you understand the culture, the background, where that word came from, or the meaning of that community. And then we have the Latino cues, and this is more a whole rhetoric kind of way of communicating, where you are speaking all in English, 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 and then you add a word in Spanish, just to create a sensation of what you're trying to say and create some kind of powerful messaging. A lot of our Latino leaders in Austin, at least, utilize these Latino cues as they're giving speeches, whether it's for the Latino community or even people that don't speak Spanish, but understand that you're part of that culture. Very quickly, I want to talk to you about a little bit about how to bring people together. And to bring the Latino and perhaps other communities as well, there's certain theories that help as you're creating your engagement participation. And one of them is the proximity model. The proximity model is basically what's the distance between the power and the person that is participating in your event. And this is something that you need to be very clear. Many times when I create an engagement, there are people that, city council, elected official, community leaders, and what I try to do is to bring it closer to the community, so the proximity model is not as far away, and you can feel that these members are part of the community. And so as you strategize how you're going to put your setup in terms of an engagement, think about where you're putting the people of power, how you can make them closer to the community so everybody feels welcome and everybody feels safe to basically express their feelings, emotions, attitudes about a particular project. The sense of representation is very key in the Latino community. And what you want to create is an environment that you can see different people of that they can relate to it. It will be very difficult to relate to a community that is Hispanic if your representation from your government, elected officials, or speakers are all from another group. Let's say they're all Anglo. And so it creates a little friction because people have the tendency of think, well, how this person knows what I'm feeling, what my needs are, when they don't even have any connection to my culture. And so you want to make sure that when you're having an event, you do have a representation from different groups that people can feel like, okay, this person heard my story and they can understand my story. A lot have to do with framing and how you frame the ideas, how you frame your presentation in such a way that the community will feel comfortable in listening and learning and participating. The last concept I want to talk about on this slide is called biographic available. When you decide to do a community event, think about the date, the location. Is it easy for people to participate? Is it in a place that if you have certain challenges, you can still make it, such as transportation, parking, and so forth? The more you look at those details, the greater the chances of participation. We talked a little bit about power distance, and so I'm going to move into individualism and collectivism. And in the Hispanic community, we are a collective community. However, the community is changing as we talk about how people are becoming more into the American culture, or they're born here in America. So be conscious about how people like to communicate and how they like to be together. Also keep in mind that in the Latino community, they really like to have a pattern that they understand what is happening next in supposed to being all these surprises. And so when you do an event or you have a long-term project, keep in mind and show them what the timeline is going to look like. It is very difficult to bring a community together when they don't know if they ever will see the project being to fruition. In the Hispanic community, the qualitative lifestyle is what really resonates to our community. And what it means with that is family and friendship, time together, all these aspects that enrich their life. And I'm sorry I'm rushing because I have other concepts that I may not be able to go through it. And then we have the long and short-term orientation. For the Latino community, they can understand a long-term project if from the beginning you basically show them what the timeline is going to look like and what is going to be the steps to participate. When you work with communities with many challenges, please keep in mind their needs. Perhaps these are not our needs because we do have a good job, we have an education. A lot of the communities that I work with, their challenges of every day are greater than I could even imagine. So when you bring a subject to these communities, try to phrase in such a way that will make sense to them and that will understand the value, even if it's long-term. In terms of the content development, of course, keep in mind credibility, emotion, consistency, and then try to be part of the community as you develop your content, whether it's brochures, pamphlets, flyers, and so forth. It looks like I run out of time. So I'm just going to go very quickly and share the 4 agreements of Don Miguel Ruiz. And this is a book that I cherish dearly. When you work with Hispanic communities or other communities, be impeccable with your words. Don't take anything personally. Don't make assumptions and always do your best. Here's my source list, which will probably be shared through the web. And then here you can contact me in case you might have more information, if you need more information. Thank you for the opportunity.
Marion, thank you so very much for your presentation. That was absolutely wonderful. Gratefully appreciated. We are now going to move on to Carol Newman, but just a reminder to our audience, don't hesitate to send me a chat or a question, and we will come back and open it up for a bit more of a discussion amongst all of you once Carol's finished her presentation. So Carol Newman is the Executive Director of the Alberta Students' Union. She is on the board of Nextgen, which is responsible for the youth engagement strategy at the City of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. The strategy was the result of a challenge for Mayor Stephen Mandel to get youth involved in the P2 process. Carol was instrumental in developing the strategy through cross-sector partnerships that included the public engagement community, businesses, not-for-profits, community groups, and many other segments of our community. Carol, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about Nextgen, and rather than have a slide deck, I'm going to just work through the report, and you just have to trust me that I promise it'll be far more visually engaging than any slide deck I would have pulled together. So Nextgen, a little bit about us. We've been around the city since 2006, and we're a group of young, passionate, community-minded individuals who are taking the future into our own hands by creating a city that attracts and gives voice to the next generation of Edmontonians. And specifically by the next generation, we really focus on the 18 to 40-year-old demographic. We bring our vision to life through regular events like Pecha Kucha nights, which regularly attract about 500 to 700 people 3 times a year. And it's sort of, if you haven't been to one, it's almost like a mini TED Talk. It's 20 slides and 20 seconds per slide. They're very, very popular here. We also do a microfunding dinner a few times a year called Meet, where we invite people to come. We provide them food. They cough up $10, and that goes into sort of a central kitty. And over dinner, we hear presentations for new ideas. So very small grants that go to, it might be a community project that we're getting off the ground, or something more creative, or with more of a social tip to it. And then we also do these candidate forums, which are kind of fun. And it's a small group speed dating approach to a political forum during an election. And so we've had those at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. So as was presented, we were approached a few years ago by our mayor, Stephen Mandel, to say, you guys do good work already in involving young people in city building and engagement and decision making, but how can we diversify who we're bringing to the table? How do we reach groups that maybe haven't had a voice yet? And so we did some thinking about that, and with some seed money from the mayor's office, we were able to pull together a fairly comprehensive and multi-year strategy that ended up producing a report that's really driven by community and designed for community. So I'm going to walk through that. Just take a look here. So really, it comes from this quote from the mayor that happened back a few years ago. The next generation is the future of the city, and I have great faith in their creativity and vision. And so when we were tasked with this challenge, we knew it was a big problem, difficult for us to get our hands around. So we started probably where anyone would, with doing some research about it. So the sequencing of this really was to start by doing some focus groups, and we contracted an external firm to do 2 sets of focus groups as well as an online survey. And this was really creating our sort of baseline of understanding what works, what doesn't work, how do people get on the path towards engagement, what does that really look like? And then as a parallel to that, we also started engaging people in public involvement activities. So the Center of Public Involvement started with doing a review of gray literature on youth engagement, and they came up with a really comprehensive document for us. And then our working group that was sort of shaping this and looking at next steps reviewed both of those and looked at key themes that were emerging and decided to move forward by handing it back to the community and striking an advisory committee from a wide berth of engaged Edmontonians. So people that were attached to specific groups, so for example the Edmonton Mennonite Center for Newcomers, a wonderful group called iHuman, which targets street-involved youth in creative and artistic practice, as well as leaders in the community, in civic engagement, and beyond that. And so we asked those people in our community advisory group to look at some of the themes, to review the research, to consider audiences, and figure out next steps. And really what was exciting about the outcome of this and the decision that that group made was that they didn't want to create something that was designed to appeal to an institutional audience, that being the City of Edmonton or the Center for Public Involvement directly. They really wanted something that would be would have a strong pass-along effect and something that would be easily picked up and shared in a lot of different contexts. So we'll start looking through this right now. As you can see, it's really designed to be visually engaging, something that you would want to flip through, something that you would want to share and discuss at your organization. I'll just being mindful of time, leap directly into some of the emerging themes. And there were three that really were quite compelling for us to deal with. The first one was early exposure. We found both in the review of literature and our conversations with both our research participants and our advisory committee that early exposure mattered a lot. The earlier you can get people involved, the more likely they are to develop that lifelong habit of volunteering or going to festivals or being part of public life. The other thing that we found was that, however, was really contingent on awareness and creating an invitation. You had to make space for people to become involved. You had to be thoughtful and strategic in how you would build awareness. How do you turn down the signal noise and create an invitation and awareness of your programming or events that's unique. And like an earlier speaker said, really there was a focus on fun and making an impact. And then the third component was really to catalyze and activate. So now that there's an opportunity in front of someone, how do you make it meaningful? How do you turn it into something that will resonate with them and become memorable so that there's an appetite that you can create in groups of people to encourage them to continue to be around the table? So looking onto the specific themes attached to it, one thing that you'll note is that they're all coded back. So we have 9 specific recommendations, and they all tie directly back into one of the 3 overarching themes. So I'll take some time and just speak to these individually. The first was to increase youth and next-gen representation within organizations. And so this is a recommendation not only for the city and civic partners, but for workplaces and for community groups as well. Tying next into that, establishing a depth of engagement and tailoring opportunities. What we found is that there would be sometimes a blanket call out for participation, and youth, even those that are starting their careers, don't really see an opportunity that invites their participation or would maybe treat their involvement at a level where they feel like they can actually make a difference. So it's reaching out in new ways. It's reaching out in fishing sort of where the fish are. That's a key component of having meaningful, sustained engagement. We also focused on supporting the grassroots in a financial way and expanding the capacity and the resources of groups that are already doing work in this sector. So there was a recommendation that Nextgen will likely lead in developing a citywide inventory of grants to those smaller organizations that are doing youth engagement, finding ways of them coming together in a meaningful way to partner and try out new strategies. In that same way, we really want to make sure that everyone is able to focus on engaging and supporting youth. And with that, we recognize that there was an opportunity for school boards to get involved. And so really part of what this strategy does, I think, quite well is that it understands that youth and the definitions around youth is quite broad, and we need something that's tailored and targeted and flexible that reaches youth as early as elementary school and as late as someone who's 35 to 40. With that in mind, one common refrain that we heard, especially from people that were representing some of the underrepresented communities, was plain language was incredibly important. The more technical the language, the more jargon that was used, the more tuned out people were. So passing something through the filter of an external editor or reader can make sure that it resonates as broadly as possible. And then our next recommendation is really targeted to City Hall and its relationship with school boards. So we have a unique program that brings students into City Hall and educates them about municipal engagement. And so we have some recommendations that specifically focus on what could be done to improve that. And then our last two are really focused on doing something new, and that's the first one here is working on alternative communication strategies. I'll speak a little bit to that. One of Nextgen's accomplishments in its early days and recommendations that we heard in doing town halls with the community is that we wanted to really embrace Wi-Fi. We wanted to embrace connectivity, and so we were successfully able to lobby the city to provide a number of Wi-Fi free zones in the downtown. And so that connectivity is really important to people here in Edmonton. The last one is an interesting one too, because it focuses on the workplace engagement and recognizing that you need to continue to move people along the engagement ladder, and it needs to be part of workplace culture. We need to create room in our everyday lives for engagement and public involvement. It's not only something that we can focus on during an election or during a major decision-making exercise around transformative projects. It needs to be part of who we are and how we talk to each other. So those are the 9 recommendations. What's interesting too is that we challenge the communities that were picking up this report to think about engagement, so that again it's more of a community supported strategy. So it's not only Nextgen or the City of Edmonton or the Mayor's office that is thinking about what things should look like going forward, but everyone is challenged with asking how do these engagement opportunities present themselves at your workplace or within your community organization. How do you as an individual support youth to get engaged? What should that look like in terms of metrics? Is a question for both Nextgen and the city to think about going forward. So what we want to do is take this, and rather than send it over to City Hall, we want to take it out into the community and speak directly to people and have those sort of kitchen table conversations. So there's a strong pass-along effect, and people can see ways of activating the information here, and to check back in 2 years and see have we done a better job? Have we had an impact? Whether that's charting the participation in the election process, or the number of volunteers that are engaged in different community organizations, or in other metrics. So it's a different approach, but I think one that we had strong direction from our community advisory group to move forward with.
Carol, we seem to have lost you.
Oh, no, I've concluded my remarks.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you so very much, Carol. Much appreciated. So what I actually have a couple of questions that are now up here that I'd like to ask. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask those questions, and then Drew is going to unmic or unmute people so that they can respond to it. Francesca, the first question is actually for you. How may we approach other universities to start SP2 chapters? Francesca.
I'm unmuted. Okay. It's how can a practitioner support approach universities to ask them how to start a Students for Public Participation student group, or create that relationship. I can just offer my thoughts on that to say I think it would be wise to find a department that would likely be one that has some public participation within it. For example, at the University of Oregon, this was the Planning, Public Policy, and Management Department. They had master's degrees in community and regional planning and conflict and public administration. Also, The conflict and dispute resolution program had a variety of students who were members of the student group, but also communications department, so journalism. So I would think of a department, and then you could contact them in any way you see that would work. So stopping by the university and walking into the department, asking who you could talk to, or sending an email to anyone. You find their contact information online, usually on university websites. That's an option. Perhaps others have ideas themselves of how they can make that initial link, but the Cascade chapter of the IAP2 offered a scholarship award to the Planning, Public Policy, and Management Department. And that's how I got originally plugged in to the IAP2. And once the practitioner group of the Cascade chapter reached out to our department and offered this scholarship, I then found myself in a practitioner-supported group, and I asked the other professionals, you know, I think I'm starting to think about starting a student group. Would you be able to support us? And maybe we'd like to have a student on the board on the executive board. And they said yes, yes, yes. So,
terrific.
Yeah,
so Francesca, I'm going to cut you off, and my apologies, but I would suggest that anyone that has any more questions for Francesca specifically on that, get in contact with you directly, because it sounds like you've got lots of great ideas and lots of enthusiasm for this, Francesca. So thank you very much. We've just opened up a quick poll because we're very cognizant that we're coming to the end of the hour. So for those people that would like to continue, could you please let us know, and we can continue for a little bit longer. And while you're responding to that poll, I've got a question for Carol. Carol, have you found ways to encourage Aboriginal youth to participate, and how did you do that? Carol, are you there?
Yes.
Excellent.
Hi, I am. I'm unmuted now. That's a really good question, and we were pretty sensitive to that, and that's why we made sure to include the iHuman Youth Society, which has a strong component or focus on Aboriginal engagement. And so there's work that we're doing to specifically focus on that group, but it remains, to be frank, a challenge.
Thanks very much, Carol. So we're just going to close the poll. So I'm just going to ask Drew to close that poll, and we'll just see what people have said. We should be able to see that in just a minute. But there are a number of other questions up there, so let me just keep going back to these questions. Sorry, I have lots of questions here too. So this actually is from Steph. I understand that a diversity of approaches is required in order to engage a diversity of people, but how do you know how well it is working? For example, does anyone use an exit survey that asks participants if, as one speaker stated, it made sense to them? So I don't know if there's any questions out there, and we're just trying to see if we can make that poll work. Just to see whether or not anyone's there. Anyway, there are lots of other questions, and we actually have now come to the end of our time. So my sincere apologies. We are trying to see whether or not people can hang in there with us on the poll, but unfortunately we're not able to see. We weren't able to see the results immediately. However, I'm hearing from Drew that a lot of people would like to stay around. So what I'd like to do right now, if anyone has a question, can you raise your hand, and I'll actually open up the mic for you, and you can ask your question directly of the participants, and I'll just keep an eye out. So if you've got a question for anybody that you haven't already written down, can you please raise your hand, and I'll try and come to you immediately. So Tanya, thank you for joining us. Your question, please. Tanya.
In Southern California, we more often hear a reference to someone born in Mexico and living in the United States refer to themselves as Mexican versus Chicano. I'm interested in the presentation by the woman from Austin where there was no reference to the description of Mexican, and in fact it suggested Chicano was the proper terminology.
I do realize that we had a lot of feedback on that, but Marion, perhaps you could respond. Marion, did you hear the question?
I did. Thank you. I was just wanting to be on mute. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. So people that are from Mexico, raised and born in Mexico, they like to be called Mexicans or Hispanic or Latinos. Chicanos are more like a cultural terminology. It means that you have a background that is from the Mexican culture, but not necessarily you were born in Mexico. You were probably born in California, probably some parts of Texas. Chicano is a little bit more common in California than it is in Texas, by the way. The way that I like to approach this terminology is basically I try to get an understanding of how the group likes to be called. Not everybody likes to be called Chicano, and everybody's going to be like to be called Mexican. So usually I just try to get an understanding of how they feel about the group. If you go on a macro level, then for example, I prefer to be called Venezuelan because that's where I'm from. Frankly, you know, like in my case, I don't like to be tagged with any group. I just like to be an individual participating in an event. The only reason that we have this classification for groups is so we can do a better job in targeting these communities to participate. Does that help?
Thanks very much, Marion. Much appreciated. We have another question from Kevin. Would any of the presenters like to talk about a particular program or initiative? I'm sorry, someone's still got a mic open. Marion, can you mute yourself? Okay. Would any of the presenters like to talk about a particular program or initiative of which they are most proud, or talk about an epic fail and why the initiative didn't work? So the presenters, you can mute and unmute yourself, so if anyone would like to respond to that, I'll allow you to mute or unmute yourself. Okay, well, let's ask someone that we haven't heard from. So how about Stephanie? Stephanie, did you want to respond to that?
Sure, Amelia, I'm happy to. I mean, I don't think I have a lot of epic fails in terms of engaging in an inclusive way, but I do think I've got a lot of successes, and they really relate to not making any assumptions. So actually stopping and asking the question, you know, about what do you like to be called? What are the right protocols for engaging in this community? How would you like to be involved? Has this approach had meaning for you? You know, what has made a difference, and what would you like to see more of and less of? You know, we embed those kinds of questions into every engagement process. We did, for example, a community dialogue in June, engaging women. Well, the terminology was women of experience, but in essence, women who have experienced abuse, either physical, sexual, emotional, from whoever it was. And one of the conversations we had in planning the session was, you know, what will allow you to participate in the best way possible so you are fully effective and, you know, we really maximize the conversation. And the thing we heard, because it was a conversation focused on women, was that for them, one of the the checklist rules was that men should not be allowed to participate. And that for me was I had to really check my own response and reaction to that, because I thought, well, not all, certainly very few men are abusers, but it went to the comfort and safety and security of the ability of these women to participate. And so when I suspend my own judgment, it actually serves the group. I think the ability to ask those questions and to suspend your own judgment about how you're creating a safe space, a safe and constructive space for people to participate to their fullest ability is really important.
Thanks very much, Steph. I am going to come back to the other presenters to ask them if they have an epic success or an epic failure. But before I lose people, because I'm well aware that I am now starting to lose people, I do want to remind everyone that we have webinars hosted by IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA every second Tuesday of the month. Our next one is Beyond Online Engagement and 144 Characters. And our December webinar is Members' Choice, Our Gift to You. And basically that is, we want you to suggest a topic. We'd like to hear from you what you'd be interested in. And you can always get hold of IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA. To get hold of IAP2 Canada, go info@iap2canada.ca. And for the United States, go to admin@iap2usa.org. We'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear how you're enjoying these webinars, and we'd also like to hear whether or not you have other topics. So we're going to continue this conversation for another 5 minutes because we did have 71% of you say that you'd like to carry on for a little bit longer. So I'd like to come back to our speakers to respond to Kevin's question about epic successes and epic failures. And at the end of 5 minutes, we'll say goodbye to everyone. But let me turn it over to Carol Newman. Sorry, let me turn it over to Francesca. Any epic successes or epic failures you might want to share? Francesca.
Okay, well, with regard to Students for Public Participation, I can only say that we scheduled an important event during finals week. You can imagine that we did not have the turnout that we expected, and that was very disappointing because we had a guest speaker. However, we learned a lot from that, and the focus on fun is important, but we also have to make sure that we're fitting in students' lives. Students have a lot going on in them, and even if they say they're going to be there the day of, maybe they won't because there's important things going on that go before. Thanks.
Thanks, Francesca. So I'm going to turn it over to Carol, and then Marion, I'm going to give you the last word, but we'll go to Carol first. Carol.
Yes, one example that comes to mind really readily is an example from a few years ago. We set out to do a World Cafe on some of the issues, challenges, and opportunities facing Edmonton's urban core. So we had a really large 100-person World Cafe that spanned the course of an evening, and we had great outcomes from it, a lot of really interesting feedback. But because we were working with a very small working group and it was all volunteer-led, digesting the results of that and sort of having it into shape of something that was actionable took a lot of resources, a lot of volunteer time, and we ended up with something that we were proud of and presented to City Council and got some endorsement. But in the process, we really burned out our core of volunteers. So it's always been sort of an interesting balance with Nextgen and the relationship to the city. How can we add value in a way that's unique and compelling and doesn't duplicate the efforts of the really talented people that are working for and with the city and doing similar work? So it was a lesson learned for us.
Thanks so much, Carol. And now I'm going to hand it over to Marion for the last word. And Marion, we've got a couple of minutes left. So Marion, over to you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Certainly I have my share of failure and successes. They might not be epic because I'm still doing what I do, but it always goes with this type of work. You will never have an event that is going to go perfect. I think if I have the last advice will be treat everybody with kindness, have a little humor when things don't work well, Be sincere and be flexible. If you plan for a grand finale on your event and the video didn't work, well, just laugh about it and do it verbally. If you were expecting lots of people and then your room is empty, then go ahead and put your chairs close by and make it an intimate meeting. There's always a way to work those failures, and of course there's success in between the lines, because at the end of the day, you know you did your best job, you tried your hardest, and you were honest on your strategy. And all of us that are in engagement, we have a good heart, because the only reason we do this is because we want to make a difference in the community. So at the end of the day, no matter how the results are, we try our best, we learn, and next day we have another opportunity.
Marion, thank you so very much for that. That was excellent and a great way to finish our webinar and focus on diversity. I'm sure that I'm joined by all of the participants in thanking Carol Newman, Francesca Patricolo, Stephani Roy McCallum, and Maren Sanchez for their absolutely terrific presentations today. Thank you very much. On behalf of IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you back to the next webinar in November.